Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of Saints Talk. My name is David Williams, and I look after the relationship with the university's alumni. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Stephen Reicher to you. Professor Reicher is a social psychologist, perhaps best known for bringing a revolutionary academic rigour to the way we think and talk about the behaviour of crowds. He has looked into the behaviour of people in football crowds, at religious festivals, and at what happens during incidents that are commonly known as riots, a term I am sure he finds problematic. I won't even contemplate using the term mob. He is also interested in the politics of crowd leadership and how some leaders can cultivate the representation of group identity. Famously, he was one of the first to offer an account of the appeal of the then presidential hopeful Donald Trump and show that far from the preposterous no-hope candidate, how Trump was able to assume leadership of a constituency, conservative, blue-collar, anti-elite, which he was neither part of nor even a particularly likely spokesperson for. Today, however, Professor Reicher is going to talk about how social psychology can help change behaviour during the pandemic, something he advises both the UK and the Scottish Government on, and as one of 9 members of the Behavioural Advisory Group of the independent SAGE body, which gives public and independent advice to the government and to the public on how to minimise deaths and support Britain's recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. If you do want to ask a question, you can do so through the Teams taskbar. If you put your name on it, for data protection reasons, I might not necessarily be able to publish it. But Professor Reicher is going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then he will take questions afterwards, which I will moderate. So I'm going to hand straight over to Professor Reicher now. Professor.
Well, hello everybody, and thanks for joining today. I'm told there are various classes watching this, including some French classes. So hello, I hope this is of some interest to you. And I want to start by congratulating the organisers on their brilliant foresight in organising today's talk on a day when, certainly in the UK, the issue of behaviour and adherence is very much at the top of the news. So today, Boris Johnson got up in Westminster and Nicola Sturgeon got up in Holyrood, and both laid out new restrictions. And those restrictions will only work, of course, if people adhere to them. And so the critical issue is, will people adhere? Will people limit their contacts? Will they socially distance? Will they wear masks and so on? That's the key question of the day. Now, this evening, Boris Johnson is going to speak to the nation. And Boris Johnson, having laid out those restrictions, is going to try and persuade us to abide by them. And so how does he persuade us? What will be effective? How will he get us to do the things that will limit the spread of this infection and allow us to go back to a normal life? So what I want you to do for the rest of my talk is sit back and imagine you are Boris Johnson, and this is the advice that I would give to you. Let me start off by talking about adherence, because there seems to be an assumption that adherence is a matter of motivation. If you don't adhere, it's because you choose not to do so. You choose to flout the rules. You choose to be bad. And more specifically, a narrative is growing up, which in effect says the reason why there are more infections, and particularly infections amongst young people, is because young people are breaking the rules. They're choosing to have house parties, they're choosing to drink, and they're choosing to act in ways that allows the pandemic to spread. So the implication is that young people are to blame. They're not just more infected, they are to blame for the infection. That it is the responsibility of young people to change their behaviour, and that the way to change their behaviour as much as anything else is through punishment. And I want to begin to question those various assumptions. Because when you look at the research into behaviour and behaviour change, what you find is that a number of factors are involved. It's not just about motivation. First of all, it's about capability. Do we have the knowledge? And do we have the personal skills to know what to do? After all, you can't expect people to follow the rules if they don't know what the rules are. And actually, if you ask people if they know what all the rules are, there was one survey that was done a few weeks ago looking at 10 rules. I think it was 6 people in 6,000 who got all of them right. Even when you ask, do people know the symptoms, the 3 main symptoms which are defined as the basis for going to get a test in the UK, only 14% of people know those. So how can you blame people for not getting a test if they don't have the knowledge? The second factor, perhaps even more important, is opportunity. That has to do with just the practical issues in adhering, the situational constraints, if you like. Is it practically possible for you to do what is asked of you, to lock down, to self-isolate, and so on? And at least early on in the pandemic, it was quite clear that these factors of capability and opportunity were probably the main explanation for non-compliance. So one study was done which showed that poor people were 3 times more likely to break lockdown than rich people. Not because differences in motivation. If you asked about motivation, they had exactly the same motivation to stay home. It was almost entirely to do with the practicalities of staying at home and putting food on your family's table. So the assumption that if people don't obey the rules, they don't want to, they've chosen not to, is wrong. And it's dangerous. And it leads to blame when blame isn't necessarily warranted. You're blaming people for being put in a position where they can't do what is asked of them. Now, to make that point is not to say that motivation is not important, because even if you give people the information, they have the knowledge, and even if you give them the opportunity, still they have got to be motivated to adhere. So what motivates us to adhere? What motivates us to do things that are truly difficult? Another piece of research done in May showed that 90% of the public were adhering. 90%, actually more than 90%, it was 91%. Of those, 44% were suffering. They were suffering psychologically, they were suffering materially, but they still went along with these things. Now, one of the reasons why I became involved in the advisory groups is over the years I've looked at emergencies and I've looked at crowd behaviour in emergencies. And everybody assumes that what happens in an emergency is that you panic, that people are pretty flaky at the best of times. They're not particularly good at dealing with probability. They're not particularly good at dealing with stress. You put them in a crisis and they panic. That's the stereotype, that's the image. You wouldn't have a Hollywood disaster film without people fleeing, waving their hands in the air and blocking up the exits, and so turning a crisis into a tragedy. And yet that's not what happens on the whole. And that picture is not what you find if you study disasters. Instead, what you tend to find is that people actually support each other, help each other. And why? Because in a disaster, we experience a common fate, if you like. We suffer the same dangers, we face the same problems, we have the same fears, and that common fate leads to a sense of shared identity. People stop thinking in terms of I and start thinking in terms of we. And they start supporting each other. And they become resilient, not because of their inner resources, but because others stop being other to them and become a source of potential social support. We even have experimental research to show that when people are in-group members, we're more likely to support them and to help them than if they're out-group members. That's a general phenomenon. And right at the beginning, early in March, before lockdown, we made a very simple statement. We said, don't personalize, collectivize. And that sentiment was put rather more eloquently by Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, where he said, this isn't about I, this is about we. Get your head around the we concept. And the reason why it's so important is rather simple. If you thought simply in terms of individual risk or individual self-interest, then many of us would choose not to abide by lockdown. We would say to ourselves, well, I'm unlikely to get too ill. And on the other hand, I really can't stand staying at home, so I'm going to go out. The cost-benefit analysis, when you think in terms of I, tells you there is more of a cost than a benefit to staying in. But if you think in terms of we, if you think in terms of the collective, if you think in terms of the group, then if you go out, you are likely, even if you yourself aren't going to get damaged, to spread the infection, which other people might catch, and other people might get ill, and other people might get hospitalized, and other people might die. And so the cost is so much greater than the benefit of going out. So the first point is adherence is a function of we thinking, of thinking in terms of community, in terms of thinking in terms of a social rather than an individual identity. Now, in March, that was a hypothesis, a well-grounded hypothesis in previous research. By now, there's a welter of research which shows that to be true. Even in May, early work was showing that the reason why people stayed at home was not because of individual risk. It was because of that sense of community, and it was that sense of we want to come out of this as a community. A study just done on face masks showed that individual risk has got no relationship to wearing a face mask. It's community identity. A study in the UK shows that local identity, a sense of attachment to your community, leads you to adhere to the limitations. And a 67-nation, 46,000 participant study has just made the same point about attachment to the national community. The higher your national identification, the more likely you are to adhere. So creating that we sense, creating a sense of a united community, creating that sense of we're all in this together is absolutely critical to adherence. It's critical to other things as well, because once you have that we feeling, you're more concerned with supporting others. And so we see the huge flowering of, for instance, neighborhood groups, street level WhatsApp groups, where people ask if they can help each other. Over 4,100 mutual aid groups involving over 3 million people in the UK alone. That mutual help, which provided the support which a government could never supply. There aren't enough public servants to do it. So that mutual support kept us going practically and psychologically. Those, if you like, those mutual links, that sense of group membership has been shown to be massively important in terms of overcoming isolation and improving our mental and even our physical health. So this notion of we-ness, of social identity, an abstract concept, something of absolutely central practical importance. That's one aspect of adherence. That's why we spontaneously adhere. That's why we spontaneously undertake actions which might be onerous at an individual level, but are good at a collective level. There's also the question of why do we adhere to what we're told to do by authority? Why do we obey the law? Why do we obey restrictions? Why do we do what we're told? And there's a lot of research which says it's not to do with instrumental reasons. It's not to do with reward and punishment. It's not because somebody waves a big stick at you and threatens to hit you if you do things wrong. Far more effective in obeying the law is the sense that the authorities are there for you and are part of the community, and therefore the laws are for the good of the community. They're not imposed on us. They are representative of what is in our interest. That relationship, that sense of in-group membership, if you like, between government and the people is tremendously important. And how do you secure that? Well, you secure it in many ways by treating people as a partner. If you treat people as one of us, they will respond by seeing authority in the same way. There's a body of research on what's called procedural justice, which shows how showing respect and showing trust, listening to people, heeding what they say to you are all critically important. All the things that bring us together, whereas compliance is critically undermined by anything which distances us, anything that makes us feel that authorities are separate, that there's one rule for them and one rule for us. And that's why the so-called Cummings affair, where Boris Johnson's most senior advisor took a trip to Durham and back, seemingly violating the rules, and then was defended by the Prime Minister, was so toxic. In 1 week, trust in the UK government dropped by 21 points. The pollsters have never seen anything like it. They were amazed by it. That sense of trust, that sense of being in it together was critically undermined. And so, as well as it being critically important that a government helps nurture a sense of shared identity amongst the public, it is also critically important that the government creates a sense of shared identity between itself and the public. And that takes me back to the issue of blame. That takes me back to why blaming the public for not adhering is, I think, deeply problematic and deeply wrong. Let me start off with why it's wrong. Let me start off with the arguments that young people are to blame. Now, what is undoubtedly true is the spike in infections is greater in young people. The evidence shows that very clearly. In fact, actually, interestingly, it's even higher amongst young women than young men. The real increase is amongst young women. But the question is, why is it higher? Now, logically, you're more likely to get infected if you have more contacts, if you're more exposed. So the question is then, why do you get more exposed? Now, the interesting point is that young people have been more exposed in many ways, not because they've broken the rules, but because they've done what was asked of them. So, for instance, we were asked to go back to pubs. Boris Johnson told us it was our patriotic duty to go to bars, and undoubtedly young people are more likely to go to bars. Not breaking the rules, doing what is asked of them. Jobs. At this point, Boris Johnson didn't just ask people to go back to work. He told them that if they didn't go back to work, they might lose their jobs. He said workplaces are safe, but did nothing to ensure that's so. And recent polls show that employers say that 46% of workplaces aren't properly socially distanced. 38% of the most vulnerable workers have seen no mitigations against transmission. So people are exposed, and young people are 3 times more likely to be in those jobs where they're exposed, where they're public facing, jobs like bars, like restaurants, like retail. And young people are more likely to take public transport, where they're going to be more exposed. And when they come home, young people are far, far more likely to live in shared flats where they spread the infection amongst themselves. So the question is, did they get infected because they misbehaved, because they broke the rules, or did they get infected because they behaved and followed rules that led them to get more exposed? And when you look at the adherence data, well, yes, you do find that there has been an increase in large gatherings, in house parties, the mythical house parties, but only by 3 or 4%. The real growth actually has been in small gatherings of 7 or 8 people. It's not the house party, it's people of any age inviting 1 or 2 more people round. And actually, young people on the whole are adhering to the rules. Not only that, young people on the whole want there to be more restrictions. A poll a while back showed that 70% of young people thought that the pandemic wasn't being taken seriously enough, that the measures were not serious enough. When the rule of 6 was brought in, on that day there was polling which showed that 70% of young people supported it. Not only do young people adhere, the great majority, but they want us to go further. So the adherence data doesn't point to this picture of young people in the majority running out and partying and causing the problems. The danger is, because that's spectacular and it makes a good headline, and it's a far better photograph to show a house party than a house in which there isn't a party, then we overestimate it. So it's wrong. But it's counterproductive as well. It's counterproductive because it undermines those 2 elements which I've pointed to as the basis for positive motivation. On the one hand, if you moralize adherence and non-adherence, and you say the reason why we're having infections is because particular groups are bad, those young people are bad. Well, for young people themselves, to be demonized by government is not going to increase compliance, it's going to increase alienation and a phenomenon we call reactance. People are going to reassert their autonomy, often by rejecting precisely what the government says. To demonize people is about the worst strategy of influence that you can imagine. But for other people, the danger is they becoming complacent. They begin to say, well, the problem is those terrible young people. It's not us. It's them having large parties. It's not me inviting round one or two friends. So people stop seeing the messaging as self-relevant. They only think it's relevant to the demonic, the demonized young people. And as a response, as I say, become complacent. So the danger of a blame culture is very much that it undermines compliance. And on top of that, in blaming young people, what it does is it takes the attention away from what the government is doing, from the rules themselves, and from those questions of giving information and those questions of support. So let me explain what I mean by that by taking one example. And in many ways, I think it is the most serious and worrying of all the phenomena we're facing in the present pandemic. A large 21-wave study published last week shows that only some 18% of people who are symptomatic are complying with self-isolation. 18%, less than 1 in 5. Now, if that is true, and actually the SAGE discussion of this paper concluded that it probably is optimistic because these are symptomatic people. Imagine non-symptomatic people who are contacts of those who are infected who are asked to self-isolate. There probably the number is even lower. But even if you test everybody, and we're not capable of doing that at the moment, and even if you trace everybody, and we're failing at that also, but even if you did those things, the testing system would be pointless unless people self-isolated, because the whole point of testing is to find out who's likely to have the virus and getting them to isolate early so they don't infect others. The whole system is about self-isolation. So less than 1 in 5 people self-isolating is a catastrophic figure which undermines the whole testing system. Now, you can take two approaches to that. You can say to people, well, if you don't self-isolate, you're a truly bad person who doesn't care about infecting other people, so we're going to punish you. We're going to give you large fines, up to £10,000. Or you can ask, let's do an audit and ask the question, what's involved in self-isolation? What are the practical issues in asking somebody to self-isolate? Well, some of them are going to be financial. In some cases, people might lose their jobs. They'll certainly lose money. We've taken some steps to doing something about that. What if you live in a multi-generational household with elderly people? How are you going to self-isolate? You're more likely to infect them if you stay at home. What are you going to do about that? What are the questions of accommodation? What if you have caring responsibilities outside the home? How are you going to fulfill those? What about your own psychological needs if you're isolated? We need to think of what a difficult task this is to do and how we can support people, how we can help people to do the right thing, not to assume that they're not doing the right thing because they want to do the wrong thing, starting from the assumption that people are of goodwill, and how can we give them support? And my argument would be that, yes, we've got to abide by certain restrictions, but a government that started off not by blaming us, but by facilitating us and asking how it can support us would be far more effective. Not only would that make it practically possible for us to self-isolate, not only would that deal with the issue of opportunity, it would also create the motivation, because at that point the government isn't berating us and treating us like naughty children and treating us like an other. It's treating us like a partner, and it's showing its concerns for us, and it's taking its own responsibilities seriously. And this points to a more general issue. It is almost never effective to change people's behaviour from the outside by telling them what to do, by hectoring them, by lecturing them. Not least because at that point you are giving up your own autonomy as a group and allowing another to dictate to you what to do. It is far more effective, if you want to change another group's behaviour, to change your own behaviour in ways that facilitates them doing the right thing, in terms of, first of all, enabling it, and secondly, creating that positive relationship, that in-group relationship. Look, the authorities are caring for us. Look, the authorities are there for us. If they take their responsibilities seriously, then we're far more likely to take ours seriously. And the key point then is, to get through this pandemic, it is necessary that everybody acts responsibly. Yes, we as the public have got to do it. We as lecturers, we as students, we've got to do that. We've got to show that we can do the right thing. It's also important and essential that employers do the right thing in terms of protecting their employees, making workplaces safe and so on. It's important that landlords do the right thing and protect tenants and don't evict them. And it's critical that the government does the right thing and starts off not by presuming that we are characters of ill will who must be disciplined, but starting from the assumption that we are people of goodwill who must be supported in doing the right thing. And so I finish with this. And I apologise for having gone on slightly over the 20 minutes, but I finish with this. If Boris Johnson asked me, what should you do? I would say to him, don't lecture. Set an example. If you want to pay people to obey the rules, you and your government obey the rules. If you want us to show social responsibility, then you show social responsibility. If you want us to act for the communal good and support others and even take sacrifices for others, you do the same. I've just finished by reiterating, what's the best thing the government can do to secure adherence, to secure compliance, to get us through this pandemic? Don't lecture. Actually, that's a bit rich, having just lectured you for 25 minutes. I apologise for that. But don't lecture, set an example.
Thanks, Professor Reicher. We'll call this a talk. I think it's probably the best way to go about it. We've had quite a few questions. I'm not sure we'll get through them all, but the first one is from another David, not me. If a we feeling is critical for behavioural adherence, at least as far as the pandemic is concerned, how concerned are you about the impact of increased social isolation in continuing adherence over time?
There is a whole body of research by some colleagues of mine on what they call the social cure. And this is research which looks at the relationship between a sense of group membership and mental and physical health. And in many ways, it's quite remarkable, because not only do you find relationships, but the strength of those relationships is more powerful than the most powerful drugs we know. So, for instance, let me start with something which is probably quite salient to me at my age. If you retire, and if in retiring you lose two group memberships, my academic group membership, perhaps some sporting thing I do through the department. If I lose two group memberships, there's a 16% chance I will die within 2 years. Okay? If I gain two new group memberships, with all the time I've got, I go out and I join a political party, a pressure group, a sporting group, my chances of dying in the next 2 years are 0.5%. 32 times difference. Or again, in terms of depression, if I join one social group, it decreases my chances of depression by 20% over the next 5 years. And each new group increases that up to about 50%. So the group, being part of a group, having a sense that others are there for you, is an incredibly powerful thing. I mean, we should prescribe social groups. We shouldn't be prescribing pills. Well, they're not counterposed. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I think we made in this pandemic, and by the time people realized it was too late to change it, was using the term social distancing. Because we want physical distancing, because if we're physically close, we can transmit the infection and kill each other. But we don't want to be socially isolated, because isolation, and again, the evidence shows that isolation is more pernicious to your well-being, physical as well as mental, than smoking or drinking and all sorts of other things. We want to keep social connection. And one of the really important questions is, can we devise new and creative forms of connectivity? And some of those have arisen. So for instance, I live in a family, typical family. We don't get together. We see each other once at Christmas. We drink too much and we have an argument, and then we wait until next Christmas. I suspect one or two other people might recognize that pattern. During the pandemic, we started getting together and have family quizzes every Sunday. There was an increase in connectedness. So I think one of the really important questions is, can we be creative? And can we find new forms of connectedness to make sure that we don't socially distance? And incidentally, and this is my plug, we have in fact written a book about the pandemic, myself and some colleagues, called Together Apart. It's available as a free download, so you don't have to pay anything. You can, if you want, buy it as a hard copy. But we call it Together Apart because our point is precisely that how do we, if you like, manage this paradox of physical separation and social connectedness, because that's an absolutely key question. And if we address it, the good news is that the solution will be of significance even after the end of the pandemic, because loneliness and isolation is another pandemic that's going on in our society.
Thanks, Tim. A question from Claire. Great talk, love this. If you were PM, what practical measures would you take to support compliance tonight? What would you tell the nation?
Well, I would start off, and I must say, and of course, there's a PM and there's an FM. And I think it is very telling that, for instance, a week ago, at the same time that the UK government and Matt Hancock was blaming young people for the pandemic and was telling them not to kill their granny, rather patronising as well as a rather sexist message, Nicola Sturgeon, and I should say I'm not a member of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon got it dead right. She said, look, I'm not blaming young people. I recognise that young people are more exposed because of their working situation and their lives. So number one, she didn't blame. And secondly, she always stresses, and I think it's really important to stress, joint responsibility. She stresses the responsibilities of the government. She stresses how it is if they've got to do their bit, and in that context, then we're more likely to do our bit. So I think the messaging, and perhaps I'm biased because I've been involved in designing some of the messaging, but some of the messaging in Scotland, I think, has been rather good. In terms of practicalities, I would talk about a process. I would say that before you introduce any measure, do an audit which asks what are all the barriers to individual adherence. And I would include in that, if you like, a black and minority ethnic audit, because again, one of the problems is it's more difficult for some groups than others, and we've rather forgotten about the issue of black and minority ethnic inequalities in this pandemic, and they're very stark, and a lot of them have to do not with biological and physiological factors, but the greater difficulties and the greater exposure of black and minority ethnic people. So I'd say do that audit and make sure then you've asked the questions, how can we support people in terms of all the measures that we ask of people? So getting very concrete, I've already given some suggestions around self-isolation. So self-isolation, I would compensate people so they don't lose wages. I would try and draw in community groups, those mutual aid groups, to help people in terms of perhaps doing the social care that they can't do for others, in delivering food, in having a buddy system to be in contact with people. I think there are all sorts of concrete things. It would take too long to go through all the measures and illustrate what could be done. But I think that would be a really positive approach, because then people would see that the government, as I say, isn't just hectoring them, it's acting for them. It's providing the context in which we can do the right thing. And most people do want to do the right thing.
Now a question from Anonymous. how can you expect and assume, quotes, good, unquote, behaviour in an environment like in the US, where there are widely different facts consumed by different political tribes?
Well, leadership is absolutely critical in this. Leadership is one of the other topics that really interests me. We've just finished another book on leadership, and actually, before I spoke here, I'm just finishing off a paper which is about leadership in the pandemic, good and bad leadership. I spoke about that sense of shared identity that's absolutely critical, but it's fragile. It is fragile, and bad leadership can actually tear it apart. And good leadership can bring us together. Good leadership is leadership that not only rhetorically brings us together, talks to us, makes us think of ourselves as groups, but practically introduces measures which allow all of us to adhere equally. I'm really struck. One of my favorite quotes from the pandemic is from a woman called Bonnie Henry, who was the chief medical officer in Vancouver in British Columbia. And she said, look, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boats. Okay? And some people are in sinking boats and some people are in luxury liners, and you can't bring people together unless you address those things. And things like the furlough scheme, things like support for the self-employed were really important for making it apparent that, yes, to some extent we were in this together. It wasn't just rhetorical, it's a reality. So good leadership is about what you say and it's about what you do. Bad leadership can very easily tear people apart. So, for instance, Donald Trump very clearly politicized the issue of wearing masks. He linked it to the issue of freedom, of Second Amendment rights, at which point it became a symbol of identity and opposed identities. It became a symbol of conflict. In the UK, to some extent at least, it hasn't been done in that way. And the notion of wearing masks has been used as a symbol of caring for others. It's been a symbol of unity within the community. So bad leadership, I mean, it's not inevitable these things will happen. Bad leadership can polarize things at worst. And I think actually it's really important to give this rider, because groups, when they're inclusive and when they're unified and where everybody is involved, can be very positive things. When you go from that inclusive sense of we to a sense of we and they, of group in division, then things can get nasty. And if you look historically at pandemics, you find in many pandemics we had situations where a we, part of the community, blamed a they, some sort of demonized other, for infecting us. In the Middle Ages, for instance, in the Black Death, Jewish people were blamed for the pandemic. And Jewish people were targeted. And in Strasbourg, on one day, and it was St. Valentine's Day, 1349, 2,000 Jewish people were burnt to death. And as soon as you start blaming, the danger is that very easily goes to blaming particular groups, and that very quickly goes to social division, to racism, even to racial conflict and violence. So we've got to be very careful indeed that bad leadership and divisive leadership, and leadership which begins to blame particular groups, not only stops adherence, but turns a pandemic into a pogrom.
Thanks, Professor. I'm just going to, we've had a few questions on whether or not there's going to be a video recording available of this, and we are going to, which is being recorded, and we're going to release it on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So if you look out for that on the St Andrews Alumni YouTube channel. I'm going to go to a question, a very practical scenario from Annie. The other day I was on the overground in London. A police officer came through and at least 5 people put their masks on when they saw him. After he moved on to the next carriage, they immediately took them off. Looking at behavioural science, why would they do that? Is it a lack of knowledge? If so, do we not have a personal responsibility to research and learn instead of waiting to be informed?
Well, I mean, behaviours like that presumably indicate that people know that they're supposed to wear masks, and so they only do under surveillance. And it's perfectly true that there are some behaviours that we don't want to do, but we will do to avoid punishment. But it also illustrates the ineffectiveness of punishment compared to persuasion. So it's a point we always make in terms of leadership, that I can get you to do something by putting a gun to your head and saying walk left. You will walk left. But if I'm not there, if I take that gun away, not only will you not walk left, you'll probably walk right just to show that you can. And so if you try and use punishment, the difficulty is that it requires more and more resources, and it becomes more and more difficult. And using it to make people wear masks is not going to be more effective. What persuasion does, what saying to people, look, this is important, and getting people to value it, means that even when you're not there, they will do it, and they might even persuade others to do it. Now, I think one way of doing that, first of all, is going to be just the more general way we relate to the public. I think, as I say, a relationship between authority and the public, which is one of imposition, which is one of lecturing, which is one of blame, is far more likely to alienate people and undermine, if you like, the spontaneous motivation to act. People might act when under surveillance, but they'll stop. I think a more general attitude, which is an attitude of respect and partnership and supporting the public, is really important. Secondly, I think it's important that we make clear that there are social norms, that most people don't support that type of behaviour. Perhaps some sort of symbol, a badge, a colour that we wear to say that, we are acting for each other and we care for each other. Because another finding from psychology that I think is powerful is often the relationship between our attitudes, what we think personally, and our behaviour is a function of what we think the social norms are. Even if we don't want to comply, if we think that the norm is to comply, we are likely to do it. So creating a context in which there is a public norm, and that public norm is made obvious in some way, as I say, a badge, a colour, or whatever, then it is more likely that those who feel that masks should be worn will feel empowered to say, look, please can you wear that mask? I've got asthma, please, I don't want to get ill. And people who don't want to wear masks don't feel confident in not wearing masks. Norms are a far better way and a more efficient way of changing behaviour, I think, than just using repression. Now, having said that, I'm not saying we should be completely Pollyanna-ish and never use enforcement. I think when there is a normative consensus that a particular behaviour is wrong, I think it makes perfect sense then to do something about it. But if you have enforcement without normative consensus, then actually enforcement can be counterproductive. And you see that in a number of countries where people broke restrictions which were seen as unfair and illegitimate. And when the police were heavy-handed, it led to conflict and even riots. That happened in France, and it happened in Chile as well. So build norms, build normative consent, then perhaps some enforcement. But without it, pure reliance on enforcement will be counterproductive. Sorry, a long answer, but it's a very important question and it raises complicated issues.
We're just hitting time, I'm afraid. I'm going to ask a final question from Kate. How do you draw a line between nudge theory, working with the grain of human tendencies, and manipulation? E.g., when flu vaccination for primary school children was introduced a few years ago, parents were told it was to protect their children. But this is Kate's point, but the report by the Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunisation, on which the policy was based, said it was actually an attempt to protect unvaccinated older people by vaccinating their grandchildren. If the health outcome was good, does this justify manipulating people's feelings?
So let me be clear. I am not a nudge theorist, and I have huge problems with nudge theory. Now, one problem is that there are different meanings to nudge theory, and nudge practice often deviates from nudge theory itself. But nudge theory is based on, if you like, that I thought of giving my whole talk around this, I should say, of two ways of thinking about human psychology and human behavior. And nudge theory is rooted in that traditional view that human beings are psychologically fragile, can't really be reasoned with, don't even know the reasons for their behavior. So you can't reason with people and you can't persuade people. What you can do is use little nudges so it changes their behavior, even if they're not aware why. Now, I think that is wrong. I think that actually people are far more able and far more resilient. And what's more, the real danger with nudge theory, and nudge theory is very popular with government, is that it leads to an assumption that you can't be open with the public and you can't tell the public the truth. You have to patronize them. It leads to a very paternalistic form of behavior. And my argument would be precisely that's what undermines the trust and the sense of commonality between the authorities and the people. If you treat people as if they're children and they need to be shepherded, you are not going to have a positive relationship. And if you create that positive relationship and create that sense of identity, then actually people are very resilient. So I think the problem with nudge is actually in many ways it's not that different from manipulation. And my argument would be that actually openness, admitting your mistakes, admitting uncertainty, all these things are absolutely critical for people to trust us. And I think that's true not only of government, I think it's also true of science and of academics. See, one of the things that has happened over the recent years, and it happened around Brexit, was positioning academics, experts, as part of an elite, the other. And once you position people as the other, as I've explained, you're less likely to be influenced by them. Now, I think that was toxic politically, but we allowed that to happen. To the extent that our institutions are elite institutions which aren't equally open for everybody, to the extent that our science isn't open and we give people all the information about what we're doing and we are candid about our limitations, then the danger is that we will play into the hands of those who want to cast us as an elite, cast us as other, and stop people listening to us. So again, it comes back to this. If you don't respect the people won't respect you. If you don't trust the people won't trust you and be influenced by you. So again, if one of the slogans that I gave to you was set an example, another slogan would be trust the people, not only for the moral reasons which are outlined, but for pragmatic reasons. If you don't trust people, if you're not open with them, then over time you'll pay the price.
Thank you very much, Professor Reicher, and it's a wonderful polemical point to end on. We didn't have a question from anyone called Boris, regrettably, but he may have asked something anonymously, and we'll see, I guess, in the next hour or two whether or not he was listening. I'd just like to remind everybody that your free book is available, Together Apart: The Psychology of COVID-19, which is available as a free download, and we'll add that to the chat shortly, and also we'll put it on our YouTube channel as well. And as I say, the talk will go onto our YouTube channel. We have some more events coming up in the next couple of weeks, which you can again see some of the past events on the YouTube channel, and also join us for our series Meet the Author on the Alumni Facebook channel. But once again, on behalf of everybody, we had a lot of people on the call and a lot of questions that regrettably we weren't able to get to. But this was a very popular talk, both in terms of kind of the numbers attending and the amount of stimulation that I'm seeing on the questions.
David, can I just say that if people want to email me, if they have questions that we couldn't answer, entirely my fault. My mother was told after her first job, you're all right, but you talk too much, and it clearly runs in the family. So I apologize for talking too long and not allowing you time to ask questions, but do email me. If you want to email me and ask a question, I would be delighted to respond.
Thank you for that very generous offer. I'll wrap. Just could you let everyone know your email address, Stephen?
Yeah, it's very easy. It's my initials. So SDR for Stephen David Reicher at St Andrews, st-andrews.ac.uk. Fantastic.
Thank you again for that very generous offer and for the fascinating non-lecturing lecture which we've had tonight. I'm going to call an end to it now, but thank you to everybody for taking time out of your evening to attend, and thank you particularly to Professor Reicher for his contribution.
Thank you for listening.